Ezekiel 26 tells us the story. Son of man, because Tyre said concerning Jerusalem, Aha, the gate of the people is broken, it has swung open to me, I shall be replenished now that she is laid waste. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Tyre, and will bring up many nations against you, as the sea brings up its waves. For thus says the Lord God, Behold, I will bring against Tyre from the north Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon with his horses and chariots, and with horsemen and a host of many soldiers. As the sea brings up its waves. And how does that play out? Tyre trying to take advantage of Jerusalem in their depressed state, wants to bring war against them and take siege of them. So God brings judgment against them as a sea bringing up its waves, and it's a nation coming in to do war. And as it continues on in Ezekiel, saying, For thus says the Lord God, when I make you a city laid waste, like the cities that are not inhabited, when I bring up the deep over you, and the great waters cover you. Genesis 1:2, the land was unformed and void, and there was darkness on the face of the deep. Here we have the cities laid waste. The land was unformed, and like the cities that are not inhabitant, it was void. When I bring up the deep over you, and there was darkness on the face of the deep, and there was the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, and the great waters covered you. So we see this as a replay, a retelling of Genesis 1. And what is it talking about? When a nation from afar was brought in over as judgment over top of another nation by God. As we read in Genesis 6, it says, For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything on the earth shall die. And in the 600th year of Noah's life, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain fell on the earth. Well, this is what we just read. Those are the storehouses of the heavens being opened up, and the great deep was allowed, and the hail fell, and the rains fell, and the flood came. It's the same language of destruction we just read over Tyre and over Israel, and that which was promised for Ephraim. We read in Revelation that the waters you saw, where the Horeth sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And this is an angel interpreting Revelation, saying this is what those represent. The same thing with Daniel, who had a vision of four great beasts that came up from the sea, diverse from one another. The angel explained, These great beasts, which are four kings, which shall arise out of the earth. The waters and the sea are covenant terms for people groups. Just as we see in Psalm 93, the floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring, mightier than the thunders of many waters, mightier than the waves of the sea. The Lord on high is mighty. Just as we read in Isaiah, Oh, the thunder of many peoples. They thunder like the thundering of the sea, the roar of nations, the roar of the roaring of the mighty waters. They roar like the roaring of mighty waters. The nations roar like the roaring of many waters. But he will rebuke them, and they will flee far away. The floods, the sea, those who come in and are used as a war instrument to judge God's people, and that's described as his wrath being poured out upon them. As we read in Isaiah 8, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. Therefore, behold, the Lord is bringing up against them the waters of the river, mighty and many, the king of Assyria, and all of his glory. And it will rise over all of its channels and go over all of its banks. It will sweep on into Judah. It will overflow and pass on, reaching even to the neck. Its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land. Be broken, you peoples, and be shattered. Strap on your armor and be shattered. Strap on your armor. Why? We see the wealth of Damascus, the spoil of Samaria being carried away before the king of Assyria in Isaiah 8. And Isaiah 8 it says, so put on your armor. They're going to war, even though it's being described as a flood. Nahum continues, but with an overflowing flood he will make a complete end of its sight, and he will pursue his enemies into darkness. Just like in Psalm 36:6, your righteousness is like the mountains of God, and your judgments are like the great deep, which God has scooped up and stored in the storehouses for the day of wrath and the day of war to be poured out upon those people who are in transgression. Just as it says in Daniel, there after 62 weeks the Messiah will be cut off. The people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city, destroy the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. And how did this come? Just as Jesus said, for the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. Just as Daniel said, a flood. For they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. And what was the coming of the Son of Man in AD 70? The Roman army, a neighboring nation, brought in with spear and arrows and the sword to destroy and burn down Israel and the temple, to end them as a people. And that's the continuing motif of the water flood scenario all the way through the whole scriptures, just as Daniel said. Their end will come in the flood when they destroy the city and the sanctuary. And it'll be just like the days of Noah. For when the flood came, it took them all away. And that's what happened to Israel. And it was Rome, the flood, who came and took Israel and the temple away. It was the language of the land. You see, the whole earth used the same language in Genesis after the flood of Noah. And they journeyed eastward. All the children that came off the boat with Noah, the children then who populated into the 70 nations, they journeyed eastward. They filled the southern plain, Shinar. The people of Noah, the children who survived, the one group from Eden, the region of Shinar. And just again to point out, they went and found the plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. The region of Shinar is mentioned 8 times in the Old Testament and always in reference to historical Babylonia. It included both its northern Akkad and southern Erech kingdoms, and sometimes collectively called Sumer. Sumer, the site of the earliest known civilization, located in the southernmost part of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, in the area that later became Babylonia, is now the southern area of Iraq. And we read about this area of the uncontrolled water supply in the river valley. See, the farmers who had moved into Sumer faced many challenges. One of the biggest problems was the uncontrolled water supply. During the spring, rain and melted snow from the mountains flowed into the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, causing them to flood across all the plains. But no one could be sure exactly when the floods would come. For much of the rest of the year, the sun-baked soil was dry and hard as stone. Hot, strong winds blew thick layers of dust across the ground. Faced with such dramatic seasonal changes, farmers had to constantly struggle to raise crops. Either they had too little water or they had too much. To succeed in growing food, they needed a way to control the water so they would have a reliable water supply all year round. So, Sumerian farmers began to create irrigation systems to provide water for their fields. They built earth walls along the sides of the river to prevent flooding. Over time, the Sumerians learned other ways to control the supply of water. One of the major concerns of the Mesopotamian kings and emperors was always flood protection and irrigation management. Since early civilizations in the periods of Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and the Islamic eras, all of them had paid a lot of attention and spent much effort to organize and manage water resources in Mesopotamia. Flood protection issues flood protection issues being always central among the main works. We read today still in Iraq, as they are now the people living in the times controlling that land, are also still currently spending a great deal of time and energy managing the water systems. As we see here in Iraq, the water year, or hydro year, is considered to denote the sequence of all hydrological events in one year. Its beginning is taken from the 1st of October and continues till the end of September the following year. Water levels in the rivers tend to be at their lowest in September and October, which then start rising due to rainstorms followed later on by snow melt in the catchment areas. The flood season can be separated into two periods, beginning in October and ending at the end of March. The floods of this period are caused by rains and their runoff, and they are unstable because of their dependence on rainstorms, which come suddenly. The second period is more stable, and it begins in March and continues in April till May. The main floods of this stable period are caused by snow cover melting. The main floods or spring floods record high levels in the rivers when rainstorms are accompanied with the snow melt. The flood of the Euphrates normally starts about 2 weeks after the flood of the Tigris and ends about 1 month after that. Just as we read here, local Mesopotamian flood in the spring, the melting snow and steady rain in the mountains of northern Iraq produced flooding in the valley of the south, right where the people of the Hebrews, the Noah survivors, went into the southern Mesopotamia area and they settled in the land of the floods. And we read, interestingly, just as we're reading here, the melting snow comes out of those northern mountains, mixing with the rain and creating overflow. Just as we read in Jeremiah, the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet concerning the Philistines. Behold, waters are rising out of the north and shall become an overflowing torrent. They shall overflow the land and all that fills it. The city and those who dwell in it, at the noise of the stamping of the hoofs of his stallions, at the rushing of his chariots, at the rumbling of their wheels. The fathers look not back at their children, so feeble are their hands. Out of the north comes the flood waters over the people in judgment. It's the same language repeating in the picture of the natural cycle of the water system, of the freezing of winter and the thawing into spring. We also read that earlier in Ezekiel when it was talking about how Tyre said concerning Jerusalem that the gates of the people were broken, and he was going to take advantage of this, and God was going to bring up the people against them as the sea brings up the waves. And it says, Behold, I will bring against Tyre from the north Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, with his many soldiers, and the great deeps will cover you. Every year, God released the flood from the mountains in the physical land of southern Mesopotamia from the northern mountains. And some years it brought devastation, and some years it brought abundance. This was God's judgment, that every year God had determined through the natural process, through his selection, by releasing flood waters to take out settlements, to take out cities, to let those remain that do. Sometimes the flood would bring regenerative waters, bringing a bountiful growth to the land and a great regeneration and great produce and just a good year of harvest for the people and abundance for that time. But if it didn't come properly and the rains didn't come on time, it was a desert and you had nothing and you perished. So God's judgment, his floodwaters, were a part of the day to day living existence needs and expectations of the land that has been all the way from the recording of time to this current time dealing with those exact same issues. That worldview of understanding the mountains, the natural systems that God put within that system, and their worldview that God was behind those natural systems, that's the same worldview of God that's being applied by the Bible authors to the events of the people of Mesopotamia. So just as floodwaters would come down the mountains and wipe out people as God's judgment, well, then a flood from the north was the wrath of God coming, which was God bringing a nation in war as judgment upon another. They were using the natural to describe the spiritual. If God's judgment was a flood coming down the mountains, going into the basin and to the lower plains and washing out the Hittites, then when a neighboring nation came up against another nation and wiped them out, it was likewise described as God's judgment in the language of a flood.